conversations I've thought a lot about over the last few years is, especially learning neurology and coming from a background of different experiences as it relates to faith, is this conversation around fear and safety and how much it affects every single human being on the planet. There are a few things that I've learned about the basics of brain function and brain development that I think lend themselves really well to being able to take new perspectives in some of these conversations that we have around theology and spirituality. And fear is a huge one. First and foremost, what is fear? Let's define that, right? Fear can be a multitude of things, especially when it's processed in the primitive versus complex versus controlled spaces of the brain. It is not a finite, easily defined, easily packaged thing. However, from a neurological perspective, fear is simply the body's initial response to literally every stressor it will ever encounter, both subconsciously and consciously, in order to initially assess what it should do in order to keep you alive. The first thing that we experience when we're born is being taken out of this beautiful, safe space that we've been used to for our entire existence, and we're projected into this cold, weird, bright, different place, and we panic. Because here's the thing. Fear and the immediate response that you have is actually what keeps you alive initially. You need to have that initial panic response so that your heart beats, so that you inflate your lungs that you've never used before, so that you can start your endocrine system and start all of those other processes that say the temperature is different, the environment is different. You need to have a sympathetic storm and have a fearful moment so that every system that subconsciously, primitively, and instinctively keeps you alive gets kickstarted. So fear, first and foremost, and stress, first and foremost, is not intrinsically evil, and it's not intrinsically negative. It's necessary. Another thing that's important to remember from the relationship of fear and safety is that from a developmental process or a neurological perspective, we actually don't even develop the hardware in our brain for memory until we're almost 3. So the first 3 years of our life are built around reflexes and built around automatic systems and built around what we call the autonomic nervous system, which helps your body to be able to regulate fight, flight, or freeze responses that are hardwired to help keep you alive long enough to hopefully rest and digest food and find a place of peace and calm, so eventually you can get to the age that you actually understand what it means to even feel safe consciously. So the way the brain is hardwired in terms of understanding these conversations of fear and safety and pain and pleasure, one of the ways that I describe that, or a metaphor that I use, is because we've talked about not understanding the difference between perspective and reality from a neurological space. From the time that you're born, and even some science shows in utero and preconception, you can be influenced by the stress and the fear around you. And if your brain doesn't know the difference between perception and reality, and realistically, it doesn't know the difference between a bear and a deadline. One of the things that I tell all of my patients that I work with, and anybody that I get a chance to have a conversation with like you guys, is to think through what's happening in your body as you're having stress responses. Because remember, your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, those places that are automatic in terms of fight, flight, or freeze, and rest and digest, they live in the same real estate that controls and governs your physical body. So let's think about that for a second. And you guys feel free to answer honestly. It might be different for some of you. But if a bear is chasing you in the woods, what's the likelihood that you're gonna stop and take a poop? Okay? Because what happens if you decide to take a poop?
You're dead.
You're dead.
Gonna get you.
You're gonna get eaten, right? What is the likelihood if you're running from a bear that you're gonna stop and have a board meeting about how to handle the bear, right? So cognition and rational thought and deductive reasoning and logic are not always on the forefront of your mind when you're freaking out. So it's understandable sometimes to ask that teenager, what were you thinking? And they go, I have no idea. My brain shut off. I was just scared. Happens to kids, happens to adults. If you're running from a bear, what's the likelihood that you're going to stop and mate something? Right? If you think about it, how many mammals in the world spend time enjoying the pleasurable experience of intimacy? Very few. Right now, science shows us that it's 2, us and dolphins, right? Because you are in one of the most vulnerable situations on the planet when you're in the middle of intercourse. So animals are designed to get in and get out. So if a bear is chasing you, what happens physiologically to your body? Are you going to be able to produce the response that you need, not only physically, but mentally, emotionally, to be in that space, to be able to provide or receive intercourse? Probably not, which is a whole separate conversation around the vulnerability, intimacy, and safeness within sexual encounters. If a bear is chasing you in the woods, what is the chances that you are going to be incredibly aware of every sound and every movement and every sensory experience that's around you? You're going to be super aware, right? Because you want to know, was that a twig breaking because a bear stepped on it, or was that a twig breaking because I stepped on it, right? So your response to sound goes up. It's called hyperacusis. Your response to smell changes. Foods and your appreciation for taste may change. Your response and sensitivity to light, called photophobia, will change, because you have to dilate your eyes in order to take in your surrounding to choose an exit route, because you want to stay alive. So every sensory system that you have can start to change. What does it feel like to have changes in sensitivity, either dulling or hypersensitivity to taste, touch, sight, sound, smell, and especially your response to balance and your sensitivity to movement? If a bear is chasing you in the woods, what's the chances that you're going to get that really deep, incredible restorative sleep that you've been looking for? Right? Because if a bear is close by and you take a nap, what are you called? Dinner, right? So if you're having trouble sleeping and you're having trouble getting really restorative sleep, and you always wake up sluggish, or you have trouble going to sleep because your mind is racing, all of those troubling thoughts are tiny little bears running around in your head. Give yourself a chance to realize that they're not going to kill you and they're not going to eat you. They're just going to bother you. If a bear is chasing you in the woods, what's the chances that if you get a chance to hide behind a tree and that bear's on the other side, how much noise are you going to make in terms of your breathing? You're going to shout? You're going to breathe deep? So one of the first things that happens when we get into these fight or flight responses, even if it's trying to get that email in time before the boss shows up in the office, right, or it's trying to book that ticket, you're going to naturally decrease not only the volume of air that you bring in, but the amount of times that you breathe properly per minute. You may shallow breathe and slow down to the extent that you don't even bring oxygen in, or you may start hyperventilating and you're breathing way too much, but not deeply. So taking deep breaths is one of the fastest ways that you can make a real impact on stress, because you stop and go, when's the last time I took a really solid deep breath and gave myself a chance to just, whoa, I've got so much tension in my body. So these conversations around the changes that happen in our body are really, really helpful if you're not an introspective person, if you're not somebody who's really tuned in with what you're thinking and what you're feeling. All of us can step back and go, do I feel like I've been taking deep breaths? Do I feel like I'm getting really good quality restorative sleep? Does it feel like my heart is racing and my blood pressure's up and I'm always sweating, and it just feels like I'm sensitive to not only my experiences in the physical world, but I'm just sensitive emotionally and I always have thoughts that are racing? Those places give you the chance to just stop and reflect and take an inventory of the things that can sometimes happen as we see stress increase in our life. It's important to know that the systems that drive your thought processes and the systems that drive how you react to pain or pleasure, fear or safety are rooted in an origin space that is tied to keeping you alive. A couple of other systems that are involved in those really, really old primitive spaces include your limbic system and your amygdala and your hippocampus and your thalamus and hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Now, all of those fancy words just basically mean that there are a lot of subconscious background manufacturing employees that are designed, as soon as they see something that needs to be handled, they're going to assume until told otherwise that that is a 5-alarm fire they need to put out. If it's an emotional situation combined with a fearful situation, it's even more powerful. And realistically, most of us have had some sort of wounding or some sort of issue in our past that we are still working through that is hardwired in our system. So what is something that we might practically see that's rooted to an old, primitive, hardwired fight or flight response that might even include emotionality? Well, let's give a more practical example that probably everybody could relate to. Let's say that you're in a car and you get rear-ended and somebody just absolutely slams into the back of you. You move past just a sheer fear response into an emotional response, especially if it's one that was a near-death experience, or even if you can imagine what it would feel like if you've never even been in that kind of car accident. And trust me, your imagination is that powerful, because how many of you know where you were when 9/11 happened? How many of you were in New York? It doesn't matter if you're there, it matters if it feels like you're there, right? So how many of you remember where you were when September 10th happened? Probably not too many. But when September 11th happened, you know what time of day it was, who you were with. You may even remember what you were wearing, where you were going, and where you decided not to go once you stopped and watched the news. Because your brain thinks it's actually happening to you. So if you look at a car accident, let's imagine, or let's say that you were in a pretty severe car accident and you combine not only those fear experiences, but the emotionality of nearly losing your life. Now let's say that 6 months later, you're fully healed and fully recovered, but you're driving down the road, and as you're sitting at a red light, all you hear is the squealing and screeching of tires in the background. What's going to happen? You're not going to sit there and go, well, I think I've handled this well in the past. I recovered, I survived. Let me have a complex and controlled emotional experience in this moment. You're going to freak out in most situations. That's the nature of post-traumatic stress. PTSD is an example of when you've had a wildly powerful experience that also happened to be emotional and connected with other systems like your limbic system, your amygdala, your hippocampus, and everything that allows you to form, create, and lock in memories. So every time you hear the screeching of tires in the background or somebody honking the horn next to you, you're going to have that same physiological response where your heart rate might accelerate, your blood pressure may change, you may start sweating, you may start getting anxious, you may have difficulty thinking, and all of a sudden you get disoriented. Because your brain, if anything, is one thing, and that is incredibly efficient at what it does in order to keep you alive. So another way of thinking about this is the idea of pain and pleasure, and how dynamic and complicated pain and pleasure can be. Your brain's goal is to, if at all possible, move you towards pleasure and away from pain. What happens though when those ideas get their wires crossed? You know, there's a really interesting process in the brain called synesthesia, where your sensory systems get mismatched, where you can taste words or you can hear colors. It's a really incredible thing that I would tell you to look up, but fascinating stuff. But we can have emotional synesthesia or mental synesthesia, which is not something that we talk about a lot. But for example, what happens if your objective is to move away from pain, but to move towards pleasure, but you live in an abusive relationship? And in that abusive relationship, the presence of the abuser is less scary and less life-threatening than the absence of the relationship at all. So somebody may say to you, why do you keep going back to that space where you're hurting yourself? Why are you cutting yourself? Why are you staying depressed? Why are you staying anxious, as if those are willful choices in the first place? But realistically, we have to understand that pain and pleasure are relative to the context of whether or not that choice is going to make you more safe and move you into a place where you may feel more pleasure in the long run. Because another way that I've said it before in the past is your brain will not allow you to pursue a future if it looks the same as your present or your past, and your present and your past is life-threatening. So when you make a choice and you talk to either yourself through introspection or self-awareness or another human being, and you're asking yourself the question, why did you do that? You have to first stop and say, regardless of what the choice was, somebody made that decision subconsciously or consciously based on a lifetime of experiences, because that cost benefit or that risk reward said my chances of surviving go up if I do that. Rationale and irrationality are very fine lines based on your perspective and your experiences. They're relative. They have to be.
You said our identity is the sum total of everything that has ever happened to us. So does that mean that our identity is to a certain extent out of our control?
You know, it's a great question. If you have had fill in the blank in your past, my point when I say your identity is the sum total of every good and every bad thing that has ever happened to you, what I mean by that is your brain is going to have to decide how it wants to respond based on previous experiences. It's going to run a quick cost-benefit analysis or risk-reward kind of analysis and say, what do I need to do based on my previous experiences? What do you do with that? What do you do if you've had past experiences that you can't change and they can't impact, that weren't your fault, or maybe they were? What do you do moving forward? The short answer, Kellen, is that realistically, the more self-awareness that you have, and the more that you're able to legitimately influence your current and future thoughts to give yourself the perspective that you are in fact safe, that you are not still in that space, that you are not repeating that experience. That self-awareness and that ability to say, I'm okay, it's uncomfortable, this may be something that I need to work through and I need to process, but it's not actively happening again. You know, self-awareness is such a beautiful resource because it allows you the chance to stop and go, you know, I have experienced these things in the past, but that doesn't limit my ability to change direction or change course. I mean, if you're on a road trip and you're utterly lost and you've had some really negative experiences, you've had accidents, people have constantly changed lanes into you, it's been a white knuckle experience just to stay on the road. There's nothing that says that you can't take an inventory or take a moment to update your navigation, stop and ask for directions, get a navigator who's able to help you in the process so you don't feel like you're alone in it. Just because you have a vehicle that has been beat to hell as a result of the experiences of your current road trip does not mean that you are destined to repeat the things that have happened in your past. It means that if you have increased self-awareness and you take the experiences that you've had in the past as an educator, you take pain and suffering and wounding as something that allowed you to gain focus and learn and increase your overall capacity and knowledge of how you respond to certain dangers or certain issues, then that self-awareness gives you the opportunity to make informed decisions. You know, we've said in different spaces in this content that your history can inform you, but it doesn't have to define you. A critically important piece from a neuropsychological perspective and a neurological perspective is it's critical to understand that if you have had a trauma in your past and it is not currently actively happening, it is important to allow that conversation, even that reminiscing, to be something where you remember it about your past or you remember it as a history lesson, not a current event. Because if your body is hardwired to keep you alive and it thinks your memory is a reality, it will respond the same way it did when you experienced it the first time. Let me give you a practical example. If you have ever had an argument in your life with another human being, everybody raises their hand. Think about how interesting it is that you can have a single event with two people and two completely different experiences. That's an opportunity for us to recognize that when you had your experience, your bias and previous lifetime of experiences informed how you responded to that argument. You can take two people with one single event and both of them will be able to truthfully explain two completely separate events. That's because it's framed in personal bias and perspective. It's also important to realize that if you have two people that have an argument and one person processes it and forgets about it, but another person processes it and processes it and processes it. If they come back 2 days later and they've thought about that argument and they got frustrated over and over and over again, think about it. How many times have you had a knockdown, drag-out fight with somebody and then you went and told one of your friends about it after you had calmed down and you started to get angry again?
Sure.
Because your brain and your body's like, oh hell, here we go again. Well, if one person in the conversation processed and moved on, and another person thought about it 40 times over a 2-day period, and then they come back, that's where you have those moments where somebody blows up and they think that the world is ending and they rage on you, and the other person in the conversation goes, okay, the response here definitely does not qualify the situation. And it's because one person went through 40 arguments and the other person went through one, because reality is perception. So simply put, if you have things in your past and you have things that you're dealing with, it's important to increase your self-awareness, give yourself a chance to process those things. If there are relevant, real-time, current traumas that are happening, find a legitimate place of safety. But if there are things in your past, make sure that you even clearly and verbally articulate that you're in a safe place and you're discussing something that's happened to you, not something that's happening to you. And that will help. So when you asked about identity and the nature of, is my identity fixed and am I stuck with the experiences and the identity I've created up to this point, the answer is absolutely no. But I think it's important to frame it out in a particular way. You have to stop thinking that the vehicle you're in is your identity and start realizing that the entire road trip and the entire journey is your identity. If you're just in the car, you may never be able to change the vehicle. But if you're going through the entire lifespan of what is your experiences, your past is fixed, but your future is dynamic. What you do in the moment based on your self-awareness will navigate your future experiences, and you absolutely have control over that. Your life is not on autopilot. You are still in the driver's seat. It's just going to be very difficult to make future decisions if all you're doing is looking in the rear view. So we talk about a big meaty conversation like fear and safety, and you go, okay, so what am I supposed to do? Well, let's discuss a couple of practical applications. Some practical applications that you can do are the Hopeful, Grateful Learning video, the Reframe and Rebound, and especially remembering to beat that dead horse that is the basics of your life around sleeping and hydrating and resting and moving and breathing. Those things that are really a part of our day-to-day life. Some other practical applications that you can utilize are remembering that if you can change your perspective, you can change your outcome. You're not stuck in the particular place. Look at it as a journey, not as a fixed space. You can also take an inventory and do an audit of what is the intensity, how strong is the situation, how powerful is it, what is the frequency, how often is it happening, and what's the duration. How long is it lasting with regards to your stresses that you experience in your life? Realistically, it's important for us to say that we cannot eliminate stress, and we don't want to, because stress is what keeps your body functioning, and thank God, helped to turn your systems on when you were first born. That doesn't mean that we can't change the level of stress that we're experiencing on a regular basis. Some other things that you can do are also to remember that if this is not your natural space to move in, find somebody who can help you with it. If you are not an introspective person who's good at thinking through what it is that you feel and how your mind works and how those stresses show up in your life, what your confirmation bias is or what your attachments are to your past, it's okay to get a counselor. It's okay to get a therapist. So let's say you're somebody who doesn't at all feel comfortable with going to somebody who is your traditional shrink or psychiatrist or counselor. That's totally okay. I have personally spent countless hours with really, really good business coaches and really, really good life coaches, and they know how people work, whether they're a licensed professional counselor or a psychiatrist or not. Give yourself the opportunity to connect with another person, whether it's a counselor, a psychiatrist, a life coach, a business coach, or a spiritual director, it doesn't matter. But most importantly, have a sounding board of a safe person who can give you pushback and challenge you to either slow down if you're moving too quickly into spaces that are dangerous, or to realize that maybe there's an opportunity for effort because you're not pushing yourself hard enough. So it's important to remember that the conversation around how you work through stress and fear and safety is 100% a process. We've talked about 3 to 5% improvement per year being a realistic goal. This is one of those arenas where 3 to 5% of improvement per year is a healthy goal. One of my favorite quotes is from Thomas Edison when he was asked about the 1,000 attempts it took to make a light bulb. And they said to him, what does it feel like to have failed 999 times? And he goes, I actually don't feel like I failed 999 times. All I did was figure out 999 ways not to make a light bulb. You know, I think it's important for us to remember with this conversation that it isn't about success versus failure. It's about intentional process leading to incremental progress.